If there is one essential habit to have in a vegetable garden, it is to sow green manures. Don't think a green manure is a green fertilizer. Actually, it is a plant or different plants. And I have selected 5 different plants precisely from these green manures. Perhaps the prettiest of all is Phacelia. Phacelia is particularly decorative. It is melliferous, attracting a lot of insects, especially bees. And it naturally weeds your garden, so it is sown mostly at the beginning of the season and a little later in the fall. Another plant that also weeds quite easily is buckwheat. Buckwheat has the particularity of being able to be sown in acidic and poor soil. It's so vigorous that it will prevent weeds from growing in your garden. One, perhaps the most well-known, is mustard. Mustard, which can be sown practically all year round except in the middle of winter, can be sown between 2 crops or at the end of a crop. In October, September-October, mustard can still be sown and will be buried a little later. And then there's one that is also very pretty. One in Greek is quite pretty too. It's vetch. Vetch has the particularity of being a legume. So we often talk about green algae pollution, for example, in Brittany. And well, the particularity of this plant is that it fixes nitrogen from the air into the soil, meaning it enriches your land. Another plant that is part of the legumes of the Fabaceae family, clover, like alfalfa, is the clover we are going to sow in our garden today. So the particularity of clover is its very small seeds. And we are going to sow them with a seeder. Before sowing a green manure, you need to partially clean your field. Sometimes just a simple rake will suffice. So I chose to sow clover there because that spot had the Cucurbitaceae family, cucumbers, melons, squashes, which are exhausting plants. The clover will help enrich the soil during the winter. As you can see, clover seeds are quite small, so I recommend using a seeder for this sowing. You can also sow it by hand, but using a seeder ensures much more consistency. So now we are going to practice this sowing. This is a broadcast sowing done by scattering. We can sow thinly. We don't have to sow too densely. Those who sow thinly will reap densely. So now we have sown this small part of clover, a small patch of, we are going to give it a little scratch on top. I prefer the claw to the rake. The rake tends to make the ground wavy. The soil is much more even, and the sowing will be much more uniform with a claw. You rake in one direction, then in the other if you wish to do so. You can also simply tamp down. Just gently tamp down with your foot or the back of a rake. And now we are going to let our seed germinate. The particularity is that we are still in autumn. So we sow on warmed soil if we want to successfully grow our green manure concerning the purple clover. Now my clover sowing is finished. It's an investment for next spring, so this clover will sprout. In the spring, and we'll see it throughout the winter period, it doesn't freeze. And in the spring, you can either turn this clover over to plant another crop or simply leave it for an entire season until the next summer, or even longer. And why not use it for fodder? Unlike mustard, mustard is sown in the fall, freezes, and is buried during the winter.